Today, we're not just chatting about history. We're diving headfirst into a casual, conversational, and honestly kind of ranty discussion about one of the most mind-blowing, rule-breaking, and just plain American things that ever happened in World War II. Seriously, it's the stuff of legends, and yet I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough. We're going to talk about the Red Ball Express. Now, before we jump into the sheer absurdity of it all, let me set the scene for you. Imagine it's August 1944. The Allies, and specifically General George S. Patton Jr.'s famous Third Army, are just absolutely flying across France. They broke out of the Normandy beachhead, tore through the German lines, and they were advancing at a speed that nobody, and I mean nobody, thought was possible. If you look at the speed of the advance alone, it's a tactical masterpiece. Patton was a genius at moving armoured divisions, right? But here's the thing. Tactical genius is nothing without fuel. It's nothing without bullets and beans, and the deeper they got into France, the scarier the math looked. Think about what the German generals were seeing on their maps. I'm talking about guys like General Oberst Alfred Jodl sitting way back at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Jodl and his staff weren't idiots. They were brilliant military strategists. They'd literally pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg or lightning war, which is all about speed and combined arms. If anyone understood the limits of a fast advance, it was them. So they get the intelligence reports on August the 19th, 1944, and they start doing what German military minds do best. They calculate. And their calculation was utterly ironclad. It was physical law, not a military theory. First, you look at the distance. Patton's tanks were now roughly 400 miles away from the Normandy beaches, where all their supplies were still landing. 400 miles. That is a monumental stretch for a fragile supply. Second, they look at consumption. They knew from painful experience what machines eat. An armoured division, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, everything, guzzled about 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day just to keep moving forward. A typical American infantry division alone needed roughly 700 tons of supplies daily, and an armoured division needed 1,000 tons. Patton was running around with 12 divisions across a 60-mile front. The total daily requirement was staggering. We're talking something in the neighbourhood of 12,000 tons of everything. Fuel, ammo, food, spare parts, every single day. And it all had to travel 400 miles over roads the Germans had tried their best to destroy on their way out. Honestly, the German conclusion wasn't arrogance, it was just arithmetic. As far as they were concerned, the Americans had outrun their own logistics. They calculated that Patton had to stop. He would halt within days, maybe even hours, just waiting for the fuel to catch up. They figured this pause would give the Wehrmacht exactly what they needed, time to regroup at the Seine River, and maybe even hold the line until winter arrived. They were so confident that the logistical failure was imminent. Listen to what guys like General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, a tank commander who'd seen it all, including the logistical collapse in Russia, was saying. Back in July, he wrote something like, "The Americans are facing the exact same logistical impossibility we faced in Russia. Their reliance on machines, their big advantage, is about to become their biggest disadvantage. Machines need fuel. They need parts. and they've advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History says paralysis is coming next. The Germans were tracking every variable. They knew a Sherman tank got about half a mile per gallon on a road, and even worse cross-country. They had it all figured out, down to the last drop of gas. On August the 20th, General Major Siegfried Westphal, who was the Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, made a definitive calculation. Even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they didn't, and perfect roads, which they definitely didn't, and no mechanical failures, which is absurd, they still couldn't keep Patton going for more than another 48 hours. His exact thought was probably something along the lines of, physical laws cannot be violated, not even by American industry. That's where they made their huge historic mistake. They were right about the math, they were right about the physical laws, but they were wrong about the American willingness to throw the rules and, frankly, sanity right out the window. So, what was the American solution to this looming, mathematically certain disaster? They were in a requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans on August the 25th, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service was looking at a room full of officers who were, frankly, very sceptical. Everyone was staring at the numbers, and the numbers said, "You're failing." Traditional logistics, railways, scheduled convoys, slow depot-to-depot distribution, had simply buckled under the strain of Patton's speed. And Ayres said, "Gentlemen, forget the rulebook. Forget what your textbooks say. We're going to create a one-way super express highway system from the Cherbourg and the beaches all the way to the front lines. Every single vehicle will run 20 out of 24 hours a day. No stopping ever unless it's for gas or a real emergency. And our minimum target, 12,500 tons delivered daily." Think about that for a second. That is not military planning. That is a production quota handed down from the CEO of logistics. It's an insane, audacious, totally unmilitary way of thinking about war. They named it the Red Bull Express. If you've ever heard of railway terminology, a Red Bull freight was an express shipment that jumped the queue. It took absolute priority over every other shipment. That's the principle they used. Absolute priority. No delays, no exceptions. The technical specifications of this thing were a literal logistical blueprint for chaos. Yet somehow it worked. 2 parallel one-way highways, one for loaded trucks going forward, and the other solely for empty trucks returning. No mixing, no reversing, ever. It was a 24-hour operation with headlights blazing, completely abandoning blackout discipline. Headlights on all night, every night. This was a massive middle finger to military doctrine, which taught that lights at night meant instant air attack. They had a no-stop policy. The only reasons to pull over were to refuel or if the truck had a total mechanical meltdown. Speed was life. They aimed for 35 miles per hour average speed with just 5-minute intervals between convoys. They had mobile pit crews with maintenance units set up every 50 miles along the route, ready to triage and fix problems instantly. And speed was enforced. Military police MPs were stationed at checkpoints, and any vehicle found rolling slower than 25 miles per hour was immediately removed from the road. If you were slowing down the flow, you were a roadblock, period. It's almost impossible to imagine the scale. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, who commanded the advanced section, communication zones, looked at the projections and must have choked. He calculated they needed 140 truck companies, a minimum of 5,958 vehicles operating at a 90% availability rate. He said that is impossible by any logistics textbook ever written. But get this, within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. On August the 26th, 1944, drivers from the 3,960th Quartermaster Truck Company were already climbing into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, affectionately named Deucey and a Half, and they were rolling east. Their cargo, 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns hundreds of miles away. The speed of setting up this system is a testament to the raw, unburdened power of American industry and can-do attitude. German officers needed weeks to plan a route change. The Germans just painted some signs and started rolling. The Germans, who were tracking everything, started to get reports that sounded like fantasy. On August the 28th, reconnaissance units, like the ones from Aufklärung 116, radioed back their observations from high ground overlooking the main route. Their reports were panicked. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing, no blackout discipline, estimated 1,000 vehicles per hour. The Americans have abandoned all military precaution. For the German military mind, this was the definition of suicidal stupidity. Headlights at night, that's a perfect target for the Luftwaffe. Continuous columns with no space between vehicles. If one truck breaks down, the whole thing grinds to a halt and becomes a giant, perfect artillery target. Yet the Americans just kept coming. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally went out to observe the Red Bull on August the 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters was almost hysterical with alarm. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science, it's mass production applied to warfare. German doctrine was all about concealment, conservation, and procedure. American doctrine, as demonstrated by the Red Bull, was about volume, redundancy, and improvisation. Where the Germans conserved every last vehicle and repaired every bolt, where the Germans conserved every last vehicle and repaired every bolt, the Americans assumed a 20% mechanical failure rate and just planned to replace everything. The numbers they achieved were utterly nonsensical to German logicians. In the first week, August the 25th to 31st, 1944, they delivered nearly 90,000 tons of supplies. Their daily average was 12,848 tons, actually above AIR's minimum target, and the operation's own fuel consumption, a jaw-dropping 300,000 gallons daily. German specialists captured the American documents and literally dismissed the figures as blatant propaganda. They just couldn't believe it. But it was all real, and it was getting faster. By September the 5th, they were seeing convoys of 67 vehicles departing every 5 minutes, overloaded with 7 tons of cargo and turning a 350-mile one-way trip in an average of 14 hours. At any given moment, there were roughly 5,000 trucks in constant motion. The whole system was a logistical miracle, achieved through sheer controlled chaos. When a truck broke down, and remember, they were running so hard that about 1,800 trucks were deadlined daily, mobile maintenance units instantly swept in. They developed a ruthless triage system, 15 minutes to fix it or push it into the ditch. If a truck was irreparable, its parts were stripped for use on others. They got so good that they could swap an entire engine using mobile cranes in just 45 minutes. That's faster than an oil change in some places today. When the designated Red Bull route got clogged up, the drivers didn't sit there and wait for a general to issue new orders. They just created their own bypasses. They were commandeering French civilian buses to move personnel around, freeing up their precious cargo trucks. They even borrowed and repurposed captured German vehicles, slapping a coat of olive drab on them and pressing them into service. I mean, they were using rubble from bombed out buildings as a roadbed to build quicker bypasses around destroyed bridges. This was an on-the-fly, high-speed military engineering project disguised as a supply convoy. The German observers were baffled by this system that violated every single principle they held sacred, yet somehow accelerated instead of collapsing. The most unbelievable part for the Germans was the fuel. Their daily operational fuel consumption, 300,000 gallons just to keep the Red Bull itself running, was more gasoline than many German armies received for all purposes. They couldn't understand how the fuel never ran short. The answer was another logistics marvel they hadn't even detected: Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. The Americans were literally laying fuel pipes across the English Channel, and by September 1944, fuel was flowing directly from England to France. They had tanker trucks running their own parallel convoy system, and fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along the route. No Red Bull truck ever waited more than 10 minutes for a refill. General Major Walter Wallimont, looking at aerial photos, was stunned. He noted that the American fuel dumps were larger than Germany's entire strategic reserves. He said they burn more gasoline, moving gasoline, than we allocate to entire panzer divisions. This isn't war as we understand it. It's an industrial overflow. And that right there is the core truth. The Red Bull Express didn't just supply Patton's advance, it multiplied his speed exponentially. German military doctrine calculated an armoured division could sustain a 20 to 30 mile advance daily at best. Patton's divisions, fueled by the Red Bull, were averaging 40 to 60 miles a day for weeks. On September 1st, the 4th Armoured Division advanced 35 miles, resupplied at noon with Red Bull trucks waiting, and then advanced another 32 miles in the afternoon. That 67-mile single-day advance completely shattered German defensive planning, which was all based on a maximum 30-mile daily rate. The great General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the actual father of German armoured warfare, refused to believe the reports in East Prussia. He thought it was propaganda. No armoured force can advance 60 miles daily for a week. Mechanical failures alone prevent it. But it was true. And what was even more disturbing to the Germans was that the Americans were broadcasting their positions openly without any need for code. They were supremely confident that they could move faster than the Germans could ever react. By September the 5th, the German intelligence reports were conclusive. The implications were catastrophic because every assumption about American military capability had to be reversed. The German officers were writing things that were just insane to read. Americans wasted vehicles prodigiously, discarding damaged trucks instead of repairing them. Drivers were operating on stimulants for days, sacrificing personnel well-being for the mission. No camouflage discipline whatsoever. Yet their air force was too weak to attack it anyway. Mechanical failure rates of 30% daily were simply overwhelmed by redundancy, and fuel consumption would bankrupt any European military. Field Marshal Walter Model summed up the growing despair in one chilling line. If these reports are accurate, we face not a superior army, but a superior civilization. They make no effort to hide because they don't fear us. They waste resources because they have infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with military tactics. The Red Bull Express drivers, however, were paying a human price the German observers couldn't see or calculate. These guys were driving for 72 hours straight, literally hallucinating from exhaustion and amphetamines like Benzedrine. Approximately 300 drivers died in accidents during the Red Bull's operational period. They crashed in the fog, they overturned on the damaged roads, and their trucks burst into flames from overheated engines. But here is where the story gets even deeper and more profound. And this is the part that truly exposes the massive, devastating flaw in the entire Nazi ideology. The vast majority of these drivers, approximately 75% of the 23,000 men who drove the Red Bull, were African American soldiers serving in a still strictly segregated United States Army. Think about the irony, the incredible contradiction. These men were on the front lines of logistics, keeping the celebrated army of a white general, Patton, in motion. They were doing a job they couldn't do equally at home. They couldn't eat in the same restaurants or use the same facilities as white Americans in much of their own country, yet they were performing a logistical miracle that the entire German military, the self-proclaimed masters of mechanized warfare and radical science, could not even conceive of, let alone replicate. They understood this irony completely. They painted slogans on their Deuce-and-a-half trucks: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They knew what the Nazis thought of them, and that knowledge, that white-hot anger at the injustice, made them drive even harder. They were fighting racism with a truck key, proving Hitler's sick radical theories wrong with every mile they drove and every ton of fuel they delivered. The Red Bull Express was their combat, and they won it decisively. Captured German officers like Oberst Hans von Luck provided first-hand testimony to the psychological defeat. He told interrogators, "We knew we'd lost when we understood your supply system. You violate every rule, yet succeed through sheer volume. You've industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension." The sound alone was psychological warfare. German soldiers could hear the constant rumble of American trucks all night, every day. Endless motors, endless supplies. They had 3 rounds per rifle while the Americans were bringing up millions. That unending sound of internal combustion engines became the soundtrack to their defeat. We're picking up exactly where we left off, having established that the Red Bull Express was this unstoppable 40-minute per day, headlight blazing river of material that absolutely drowned the German army in France. Remember how I said the German military mind simply couldn't process this kind of industrial overflow? Well, That brings us back to the psychological victory the Americans achieved, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the men on the opposing side. The true cost and the collapsing worldview. Let's talk about the German perspective for a minute. These captured officers, men who had been at the absolute peak of military theory, the pioneers of mechanized warfare, they were forced to sit down, sometimes literally, as prisoners and stare at the final figures of the Red Bull Express. It's hard to overstate how devastating those numbers were. Here are just a few of the stats they had to reckon with, and I want you to imagine you're a German general trying to square this with years of military training. The operation lasted 82 days. It delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies covering 222 million ton miles. They had a peak of 7,000 vehicles operating, consuming 700,000 gallons of fuel daily and delivering 40,000 tons of ammunition to Patton alone. They moved 15 million rations. The German officers who reviewed these figures admitted they had calculated American logistics based on European models. They took the best performance they thought possible, maybe multiplied it by 3 and assumed that was the ceiling for the Americans. They were wrong by a factor of 10. They thought they were facing an army. They were actually facing a mobilized industrial civilization. The psychological impact went way beyond just losing a battle. It destroyed their faith in their own military superiority. The German prisoners of war would stand silently at the camp fences, counting the passing Red Bull trucks. And sometimes they would just break down. They understood immediately what it meant. It wasn't just that Americans could supply their armies, it was that they could literally waste more than the entire German nation could produce. They were watching their entire worldview collapse, one continuous thundering convoy at a time. You had people like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the West, who, after studying the comprehensive intelligence reports on the Red Bull, called his staff together. He reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we face something beyond military solution. The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. Our strategy assumed their accumulating point where advancing forces outrun supplies. That point does not exist for them. They ran into an industrial abyss they could not fill. The Red Bull Express itself cost the United States roughly $100 million in 1944 dollars. That included the destroyed vehicles, the fuel, and the French civilian claims for road damage. German staff officers who were masters of managing scarcity and pinching pennies found that cost incomprehensible. But the Americans considered it cheap. That $100 million operation enabled the capture of 400,000 German soldiers, liberated huge swaths of Western Europe, and military historians estimated it shortened the war by at least 6 months. Since each day of the war was costing America about $250 million at that time, the Red Bull Express paid for itself in a single day of shortened conflict. It was simply acceptable overhead in an industrial war. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, the guy commanding logistics for the entire European theatre, put it perfectly. We wore out 50,000 trucks and 23,000 men to destroy the German army in France. In any previous war, that would be catastrophic losses. In American industrial war, it's acceptable overhead. The African American drivers fighting 2 wars at once. Now, let's get into the most critical and honestly most overlooked part of this whole epic: the drivers. We talked about the irony that 75% of the 23,000 drivers were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army, but you have to really lean into the sheer cognitive dissonance this created for the German racial theorists. Nazi ideology had this deeply ingrained pseudoscientific belief that Black people were racially inferior, incapable of technical tasks, and completely lacking in initiative. Yet here they were, witnessing African American drivers performing the biggest, fastest, most technically complex logistics miracle in military history. The soldiers themselves knew the gravity of the situation. They understood exactly what the Nazis thought of them, and that knowledge became fuel, maybe more powerful than the 300,000 gallons of gas they burned daily. Every single mile they drove proved Hitler wrong. They were using truck keys to defeat Nazi racial ideology through superior, disciplined performance under unimaginable strain. The drivers developed their own culture and their own rules to cope with the sheer brutality of the schedule. I'm talking about operating for 72 hours straight, hallucinating from exhaustion, and the Benadryl they were given to stay awake. They created their own traffic rules. Slower vehicles pulled off the road immediately, and mechanical failures were instantly pushed into ditches, which they called deadline. Any truck below 20 miles per hour was considered a roadblock. Mission completion was the only acceptable metric. Amidst this chaos, incredible stories of individual heroism emerged. Stories that defied the standard military script and highlight that incredible human endurance. There's the story of Corporal John L. Houston, who drove continuously for 48 hours to get the ammunition to the 2nd Armoured Division at Cambrai. The records show he fell asleep at the wheel 3 times but was revived by his fellow drivers and kept going until the mission was complete. Or the story of Private Booker T. Washington, whose truck caught fire from overheated brakes while he was carrying vital medical supplies. Standard procedure would be to immediately abandon a burning vehicle full of cargo, but he didn't. He drove that burning truck for 2 miles straight to a field hospital, jumping out only as the flames reached the cab. The supplies he saved went on to treat wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict. These weren't isolated incidents. They multiplied thousands of times and revealed a culture of individual initiative, calculated risk-taking, and mission accomplishment that completely superseded regulatory compliance. This was the American military culture, and the drivers of the Red Bull Express embodied it. The success of the Red Bull Express created a profound pressure for change within the American military itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, visiting the operations in September 1944, witnessed this contradiction firsthand. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded the general watching the African American drivers who had been at it for 20 hours straight. Eisenhower reportedly said, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." The success of the Red Bull had become undeniable, concrete proof of capability. It was a major factor in the push for military desegregation, which finally happened 3 years later. The African American soldiers had proved in the most crucial theatre of the war what they had known all along. Given the tools and the opportunity, they would match anyone. Meanwhile, the SS racial science publications, the people who were supposed to be able to explain everything, simply stopped mentioning the American logistics operations altogether. The evidence was too overwhelming to deny and too damaging to their core ideology to acknowledge. It's the silence of the defeated ideologies. The failed German imitation and the ultimate test. You know things are desperate when your enemy tries to copy your system and fails immediately. In 1944, during the planning for the Battle of the Bulge, the desperate German forces tried to create their own version of the Red Bull, called Operation Grief. They planned to use captured American trucks to establish their own forward supply lines. Their effort was a total immediate failure. Why? The German drivers couldn't sustain the American speeds. They were trained to conserve, not accelerate. The German mechanics couldn't repair the American equipment fast enough because they lacked the industrial philosophy of redundancy and replacement. And most fundamentally, the German fuel supplies couldn't sustain the consumption rates required for an American-style logistics system. They didn't have the industrial overflow. The German commander of the operation reported, "We captured 50 American trucks. Within a week, 30 were deadlined. Americans would have replaced them. We tried to repair them. That difference explains our defeat." That is perhaps the most succinct, brilliant, and heartbreaking summation of the entire logistics war. The winter of 1944 to 45 proved the ultimate test for the Red Bull. The winter of 1944 to 45 provided the ultimate test for the Red Bull, even as rail took over more of the tonnage. Freezing rain, snow, and ice should have shut down all-wheeled transport. German doctrine explicitly stated that wheeled logistics became impossible below -10 degrees Celsius, but the Red Bull continued. The drivers, many of them completely spent, wrapped chains on the tyres, poured alcohol into the radiators to keep them from freezing, and just kept rolling. Speeds dropped from 35 miles per hour to maybe 15 miles per hour, but the tonnage delivery continued. German observers reported ice-covered convoys moving through blizzards that had stopped their own panzer divisions. The Americans had created a logistics system that functioned regardless of weather, terrain, or enemy action. It wasn't always elegant or efficient by any standard, but it was, without a doubt, unstoppable. The post-war legacy, a revolution at home. The story doesn't end in 1945, though. The Red Bull Express had a revolutionary and completely unexpected consequence on post-war civilian life in the United States. Thousands of these drivers, African-American men who had proven their mettle operating the largest, most critical transportation network the world had ever seen, returned home. They didn't just have a service record, they had practical, high-stakes experience in logistics that simply didn't exist in the civilian world. These veterans didn't just go back to their old lives, they founded the modern American logistics industry. They used the principles they learned on the roads of France: volume beats efficiency, speed beats perfection, and if you can keep trucks rolling 24 hours a day, you can quite literally move the world. Companies like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways, major players in the American trucking landscape, were started or heavily influenced by Red Bull veterans who applied that military logistics philosophy to civilian commerce. They took the lessons of the one-way highways, the quick turnaround times, the decentralized decision-making, and they laid the foundation for the massive, efficient, and sometimes brutally fast transportation network that drives the entire US economy today. When you look at the interstate highway system, you are looking at the legacy of the Red Bull Express. They had to rebuild the roads of France from the beaches to the German border. And that realization, that fast, Dedicated routes are the key to national power. That military doctrine was simply transported home. Final thoughts on a flowing river. In the end, what the Red Bull Express truly proved was a fundamental concept of modern warfare that the Germans, obsessed with manoeuvre and tactics, missed entirely. It validated the American military doctrine that put logistics over tactics. While German officers were deep in the theoretical works of Clausewitz and studying battlefield manoeuvre, Americans were studying Detroit, assembly lines, and railroad timetables. The father of German armoured warfare, General Heinz Guderian, gave the most insightful post-mortem, writing in 1950, "We invented blitzkrieg, but never solved its fundamental limitation logistics. Americans solved it through industrial excess we deemed impossible." The Red Bull Express was not a supply line, but a flowing river of materials that drowned our forces. That line, a flowing river of material that drowned our forces, is the perfect image. The Red Bull Express was a temporary civilization, a thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, machines that existed only to feed the armies and then dissolved when it was no longer needed. The Germans built permanent infrastructure over the years. The Americans created a superior temporary system in days. It was messy, it was dangerous, it violated every rule in the book, and it was primarily driven by men who were denied basic rights in their own country. But it was absolutely unstoppable. It was the moment that the raw, almost reckless power of American industrial capacity, combined with the sheer, unyielding determination of its most overlooked soldiers, redefined the war. The story of the Red Bull Express is the story of how a logistical miracle became a strategic triumph, a psychological weapon, and a decisive, undeniable victory for the African American soldiers who were finally officially given a chance to prove their worth. And that, my friends, is why it's not just a footnote in history, it's one of the most incredible, rule-breaking, and foundational stories of World War II. The sheer audacity and scale of the Red Bull Express permanently shattered the German High Command's assumptions about mechanized warfare. Their meticulous calculations, rooted in decades of European military doctrine and based on resource scarcity, predicted Patton's logistical collapse. They knew an armoured division required 150,000 gallons of fuel daily, and that Patton's 12 divisions were 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. The math, by all historical standards, was inescapable. The advance had to halt. What the American generals did not comprehend was the American ability to apply industrial overflow and redundancy, not military conservation, to logistics. The Red Bull Express, a one-way, 24-hour-a-day highway system, defied every German military principle by operating with headlights blazing and pushing trucks to the point of collapse. Within 36 hours, 5,958 trucks were moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily, turning those supposedly paralysed Third Army into an unstoppable force. The Germans were defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior production. The most profound irony was that this industrial miracle was overwhelmingly sustained by African American soldiers in a segregated army whose performance demolished Nazi racial ideology with every mile they drove. The Red Bull Express proved that in modern warfare, the ability to supply determines strategy. If you found this deep dive into the logistics that saved the Western Front as fascinating as I did, please do me a favour, like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next breakdown of history's most unbelievable moments. What part of the Red Bull Express, the technical innovation, the human story, or the German reaction do you find the most compelling? Let me know in the comments below.